Of all of Africa's many charismatic post-colonial leaders, there is perhaps no one quite as mysterious as the late Muammar Gaddafi. The self-proclaimed brother leader who led the North African state of Libya from his entry into power in a bloodless coup in 1969 until his shocking death in 2011, was a man who inspired deep admiration and respect in the minds of his supporters and provoked feelings of intense hatred and disdain in the hearts of his detractors. From his extravagant robes to his signature sunglasses and his band of female bodyguards, Muammar Gaddafi was as eccentric as he was enigmatic. Embraced by South African President Nelson Mandela for his support for various black liberation movements both within and outside of Africa, but labeled the Mad Dog of the Middle East by American President Ronald Reagan for his defiantly anti-Western foreign policies, Gaddafi's 42-year reign as Libya's leader would see him win the allegiance and adoration of many African leaders, while simultaneously becoming a universal figure of hate all around the Western world. To some, a revolutionary and visionary hero, to others, a dictator and promoter of terror, Muammar Gaddafi was in many ways the perfect embodiment of the old adage, one man's terrorist is another man's freedom fighter. Born in 1942 to a poor nomadic community near the Libyan city of Sirte, Muammar Gaddafi's early years were very humble indeed. As a young man, he would develop a strong admiration for larger-than-life political figures such as Francis Charles de Gaulle and China's Chairman Mao. However, his biggest political idol by far would be the Egyptian president Gamal Abdel Nasser. A fully fledged Arab nationalist, Nasser would be a strong proponent of pan-Arabism, and his bright vision for the future would be one in which all Arab countries would come together and unite to break the Western world order. Deeply inspired by the ideas of Nasser, Gaddafi would join the Libyan Royal Academy of Benghazi, where he would spearhead the creation of a revolutionary group known as the Free Unionist Officers Movement, which would be modeled after Abdel Nasser's Egyptian Free Officers Movement. In September 1969, a 28-year-old Muammar Gaddafi and his band of revolutionaries would successfully orchestrate a bloodless coup against the highly unpopular monarchical regime of King Idris, who had ruled the country since independence but had long been seen by many regular Libyans as deeply corrupt and overly subservient to Western interests. Upon seizing power, the Free Unionist Officers Movement would become the Revolutionary Command Council, and Lieutenant Gaddafi would become Colonel Gaddafi. As the leader of the RCC, Colonel Gaddafi would effectively become Libya's de facto head of state and go on to be the single most important force in the shaping of his nation's destiny. Following the death of Gamal Abdel Nasser shortly after the Libyan Revolution, Gaddafi would take it upon himself to fulfill his hero's Pan-Arabian vision. All through the 70s, he would attempt to create greater political union between Arab and Islamic African states by proposing a series of bilateral and multilateral agreements between his government and the governments of Egypt, Sudan, Tunisia, Syria, Chad, and Morocco. Gaddafi's Pan-Arabian initiatives would ultimately prove unsuccessful, and after declaring that the Arab world was finished, he would fully abandon Pan-Arabism in favor of Pan-Africanism. Drawing inspiration from Chairman Mao's Little Red Book, Gaddafi would famously document his entire political philosophy in a 3-part publication known as the Green Book, which in theory at least, would serve as the structural underpinning of his new nation's entire political system. The Green Book would contain Gaddafi's third universal theory, which according to him was the blueprint for the creation of a perfectly egalitarian society which was free from the economic inequalities of free market capitalism and the authoritarian tendencies of Marxist communism. In very simple terms, Gaddafi's third universal theory could be best described as a complex mixture of ideas drawn from classical liberalism, Marxist socialism, and Islamic theology. The philosophy would reject the widely accepted Western models of representative democracy in favor of direct democracy. According to the Green Book, societies run by elected congressmen and members of parliament were not true democracies, as the voices of the masses were drowned by layers and layers of complex bureaucratic processes, which were completely alien to the average voter. According to Gaddafi, A truly democratic society was one in which decisions were taken not by elected legislators, but by popular congresses and committees made up of the voters themselves. Putting Gaddafi's political theory to the test, the Libyan state will be converted in 1977 from the Libyan Arab Republic to the Great Socialist People's Libyan Arab Jamahiriya, which, in accordance with the Green Book, would be a direct democracy, in which the Libyan people would rule themselves through 187 basic people's congresses. Each of these basic people's congresses will then send representatives to the General People's Congress, which on paper at least would be Libya's most powerful political unit, as all major political decisions had to be approved by it. But while the Jamahiriya was a democratic utopia on paper thanks to its unique legislative structure, the reality would be a lot different. In practice, the General People's Congress would do nothing more than rubber stamp all of Gaddafi's policies, which would lead Gaddafi's political opponents to condemn the regime as being nothing more than a dictatorship in democratic clothing. Gaddafi's Green Book would also place him at odds with Islamic scholars at home and abroad due to his failure to fully accept all of the tenets of Islamic Sharia law. Gaddafi would declare Sharia law inappropriate for the Jamahiriya as he considered the protection of private property under Islamic law to be incompatible with the socialist principles of his Third Universal Theory. This declaration would lead many scholars to accuse him of the sin of idol worship, as they considered that he was essentially elevating his Green Book to place it on an equal footing with the teachings of the Quran. But despite his gripes with Islamic clerics and his domestic political opponents, Gaddafi would for many years be hugely popular with the masses, thanks to his regime's rollout of a wave of nationalizations in the oil industry, which would see Libya become the first developing country to secure a majority stake in its own oil revenues. Thanks to its abundant oil revenues, the Gaddafi regime would make significant investments into the country's infrastructure and greatly improve its healthcare and education systems. Thousands of acres of land which were owned by foreigners and members of the old royal family would be seized and redistributed to local farmers who would be provided with government salaries until the farms became profitable. The government would also subsidize the construction of public housing for many of Libya's poor, and during the course of Gaddafi's reign, Libya's overall literacy rate would rise from 10% to 88%, while its life expectancy would rise from 57 to 74, and its infant mortality rate would fall from an African average of 125 deaths per 1,000 live births to 15 deaths per 1,000 live births. In the year before Gaddafi's death, Libya's estimated GDP per capita of $12,062 would be the highest in all of Africa, as Libya would also be ranked as the only African country with a high Human Development Score in the 2010 Human Development Index, posting a better score than Russia and China, as well as Eastern European countries such as Ukraine, Romania, Bulgaria, and Serbia. Unlike virtually every other African country, Gaddafi's Libya was financially self-sufficient and not indebted to any international banks or financial institutions. His regime would also embark on a number of groundbreaking infrastructure projects, the most prominent of which would be the world's largest irrigation system, known as the Great Man-Made River. This $25 billion irrigation project would be developed to move fresh water across Libya's dry lands through a 4,000-kilometer network of water pipes. Beyond his domestic endeavors, Muammar Gaddafi would also embark on developing significant Pan-African projects. The strongman of Tripoli would contribute $300 million to the commissioning of the Regional African Satellite Communication Organization, which would be instrumental in relieving African countries from their dependence on European satellite systems and save African governments a combined total of over $500 million per year. Gaddafi would also make further contributions to a number of other major African infrastructure projects for the construction of roads and railways, and would also set up a $5 billion fund which would be used for the development of five-star hotels, religious buildings, mobile phone companies, and mining companies all across the African continent. Fully embracing his ideological switch from Pan-Arabism to Pan-Africanism, Gaddafi would begin calling on African governments to work towards the creation of a United States of Africa, complete with its own united military, single currency, and single passport. Putting his money where his mouth was, he would be the most important driving force behind the creation of the African Union in 2002, hosting a number of important meetings in the Libyan city of Sirte and pushing Africa's two largest economies of South Africa and Nigeria towards greater cooperation. Gaddafi would also specifically push for the inclusion within the Constitution of the African Union of a roadmap for the creation of an African Monetary Fund, an African Central Bank, and an African Bank of Investment. His government would also cover the African Union membership costs of poorer African countries, and at some point, Libya's total contribution to the AU's annual budget would amount to about a third of the total. In the months leading up to his death, he would also announce more specific plans for the creation of an African dinar, which would be a new currency backed by gold, which he reckoned could mount a serious challenge to the dominance of the US dollar and the European Union's euro. But while Gaddafi's Pan-African exploits and popular domestic policies would win him the praise and adoration of many, his authoritarian style and his international adventurism would see him make a long list of enemies at home and abroad. Domestic critics of the regime would be routinely subjected to brutal punishments, and allegations of summary executions, disappearances, and massacres would be widespread. One of such incidents would be the 1996 Abu Salim prison massacre, in which an estimated 1,200 prisoners would be reportedly murdered with impunity by Libyan security operatives. Gaddafi's Pan-African ambitions would also see him butt heads with a number of African leaders who would grow suspicious of his aggressively expansionist foreign policies. The 1970s would see Gaddafi's government involved in a violent territorial dispute with the neighboring Republic of Chad over the Al Zoo Strip following Libya's occupation of the territory in 1973. This dispute would eventually lead to a series of Libyan invasions into Chad, which would only be stopped after the US and France deployed troops in support of the Chadian president in the so-called Toyota War. In 1977, Gaddafi's forces would also engage in a short border war with Egypt, known today as the 4-Day War. This conflict would be allegedly due to Egyptian President Anwar Sadat's refusal to commit to greater political union with Libya in the aftermath of the Yom Kippur War of 1973. This short but deadly conflict would be the climax of a long-standing shadowboxing match between the two men, which would begin with Gaddafi allegedly sponsoring dissidents and assassination plots aimed at bringing down Sadat's regime, and Sadat doing the same to Gaddafi in response. Just days after the 1980 Liberian coup d'etat, which overthrew the government of William Tolbert, Gaddafi would defy the US government by being the first African leader to recognize the government of the successful coup plotter, Samuel Doe. But despite their initially cordial relationship, relations between the two men would eventually wane as Samuel Doe would stand in opposition to Gaddafi's Pan-African ambitions. In a 1983 interview, Doe will be quoted as saying, "Gaddafi is a man who, I think, would like to lead the whole continent of Africa, which is impossible to do." Samuel Doe would then go on to accuse Gaddafi of working to destabilize his government by financing opposition groups in Liberia. And sure enough, later investigations would show that one of the major beneficiaries of Gaddafi's generosity was Charles Taylor's National Patriotic Front, which was one of the two major rebel groups that would ultimately bring down Samuel Doe's government. Gaddafi would also be a friend and supporter of the much reviled Ugandan president Idi Amin. As a favor to his friend Idi Amin, Gaddafi would send thousands of troops to fight against Tanzania in the 1978 Uganda-Tanzania War. And when Idi Amin's regime began to crumble, an estimated 600 Libyan soldiers would lose their lives trying to keep it together. And upon Amin's eventual exile from Uganda, Gaddafi would host him in Libya before his final move to settle in Saudi Arabia. From the late 70s and throughout the 90s, Gaddafi would publicly support a long list of polarizing African politicians such as Eritrea's Isaias Afwerki, Zimbabwe's Robert Mugabe, Ethiopia's Haile Mengistu, Sierra Leone's Foday Sanko, and even the infamous Central African Emperor Jean Bedel Bokassa. Gaddafi's provision of military and financial support to various subversionary movements would see him raise the suspicions of many, and to their shock and horror, he would even be proclaimed the King of Kings of Africa in a 2008 event attended by over 200 traditional African rulers. Although Gaddafi's association with many of Africa's most prominent Marmite characters would raise eyebrows around the continent, His eventual downfall would not be brought about by his actions in Africa, but his actions outside of the continent. From the early years of his regime, various investigations will show Gaddafi to be a major sponsor of a number of militant groups designated as terrorists by Western governments. In 1975, Gaddafi was alleged to have forwarded $3.5 million to the accounts of Thomas McMahon and other members of the Irish Republican Army, a militant group listed as a terrorist organization by the British government. In 1988, Gaddafi would be accused of ordering the Lockerbie bombing, which would see 270 passengers die on board Pan Am Flight 103 in what would ultimately go down as the deadliest terror attack in British history. Although Gaddafi never admitted to ordering the attack, the strongman of Tripoli would nevertheless agree to pay compensation to the families of the victims. On the 19th of September 1989, an airliner operated by French airline UTA would be destroyed by a cargo bomb, which would lead to the death of all 170 passengers, 54 of which would be French nationals. The French government would immediately blame Libya for the attack, and 6 Libyan nationals would be declared guilty by the French courts. The Gaddafi International Foundation for Charity Associations would subsequently agree to pay a total compensation package of $170 million to the families of the victims. Gaddafi's international exploits would also see him make enemies around the Middle East, and specifically in the State of Israel, thanks to his fully fledged support for the Palestinian cause. He would be alleged to have been a major sponsor of the perpetrators of the 1972 Munich massacres, in which 11 Israeli athletes would be killed at the Munich Olympics. He would also allegedly provide over $700 million to pro-Palestinian military groups residing in Lebanon, which would lead Lebanese authorities to issue an international arrest warrant against him in 2008. With an ever-growing list of domestic and international enemies, the Arab Spring of the early 2010s would ultimately set the scene for the demise of the brother leader as a series of anti-government protests began to spread throughout the Arab world. You see, while Gaddafi would for many years proclaim the democratic virtues of his Jamahiriya, in reality, pretty much all forms of dissent against the regime would be discouraged and repressed, and all forms of political organization outside of the basic and general people's congresses would be declared illegal. The Jamahiriya's revolutionary councils would for many years be accused of working to systematically repress dissenting voices through the imposition of draconian punishments and their tight controls on state-owned media. And slowly but surely, a growing coalition of Libyan journalists, political activists, religious scholars, and military groups would emerge as the regime's de facto opposition. On the 15th of February 2011, peaceful anti-government protests would be met with violent oppression by Libya's internal security forces. 2 demonstrators would be shot in the city of Baida, and a prominent Libyan human rights lawyer would be arrested in Benghazi, leading to further protests. Doubling down on their strategy, the Libyan security forces would continue to respond to the protests with violence, which would only make matters worse as the commotion would begin to spread to more cities. In response, the UN Security Council would refer the Gaddafi regime to the International Criminal Court, impose an arms embargo and a travel ban, and also freeze the assets of the Gaddafi family as well as other members of his inner circle. Meanwhile, the Libyan security forces, in full firefighting mode, would continue forcefully attempting to quell an ever-growing movement of anti-Gaddafi agitators in Benghazi and other major Libyan cities. On the 17th of March 2011, France, Lebanon, and the United Kingdom, 3 nations with historic grudges against the brother leader, would escalate the situation by proposing the now infamous UN Security Council Resolution 1973. This resolution would ultimately serve as a legal basis for military intervention in Libya, with the stated aim of protecting the civilian population. NATO forces would then be deployed to enforce the UN resolution in a US-led operation under the code name Operation Odyssey Dawn. And under the full view of various Western media outlets, the NATO-led operation would ultimately end in the violent and humiliating death of MUAMMAR Gaddafi on the 20th of October 2011. But while the UN and NATO claimed that the intervention would bring peace and democracy to Libya, the result would be the exact opposite. In a subsequent interview, ex-US President Barack Obama would describe his government's failure to deal with the aftermath of Gaddafi's death as the worst mistake of his presidency. Indeed, since the fall of Gaddafi, Libya has been completely destabilized, with several rival factions vying for control of the country in a brutal civil war. The leading faction, based in Tripoli, is the Government of National Accord, which is endorsed by the UN and backed by most Western countries, while the rival Tobruk administration has the support of Russia, Egypt, the United Arab Emirates, Saudi Arabia, France, and Jordan. The militant group ISIS has also gained a stronghold in Libya, adding even more chaos to an already perilous political terrain. The political instability and fight for control over the country's rich oil deposits has also made Libya a hotspot for human trafficking and illegal migration. According to the UN, over 200,000 people have been internally displaced and over 1.3 million are now in need of humanitarian assistance, with an estimated number of casualties since 2011 ranging from 2,500 to 25,000 deaths. The very same nation, which thanks to its immense oil wealth and relatively small population, had once enjoyed one of the highest standards of living in Africa, has now been reduced to a hotbed of fighting, medical shortages, power outages, kidnappings, and forced labor. While Gaddafi's regime may be rightly denounced for its support of terrorist activities and repression of dissenting voices, it is hard not to sympathize with the growing number of commentators who continue to insist that, all things considered, the region was probably better off with him than without him. Looking to the future, one can only hope and pray that the Libyan people manage to bring an end to the current conflict on their own terms and begin the long walk towards stability and reconciliation. Once again, it's KB Taiwo for New Africa. If you've enjoyed this video and would like to see more content like this, then please like and share this video, and also consider supporting us on Patreon at www.patreon.com/newafrica. Thanks again for your support, and until next time.